Steve, thank you very much for coming here to St. Petersburg to our International Financial Congress, and particularly for this workshop which we organized for the students. We think that this is very important for the central bank to interact with younger generation. Let me start with the following questions. In Russia, we often hear that the central bank mandate, when the central bank is responsible only for inflation, is not optimal. And there are other countries like the US, for example, and you may even think that Europe nowadays, to some extent, their central banks also seem to, even if they declare not exactly the thing, but they seem to care about growth, not only about inflation. So shall the mandate of the central banks be changed, right? And why central banks are responsible for inflation in the first place?
So the short answer to your question is no, that the central bank should focus on inflation, on keeping inflation low and stable. Price stability is the foundation for strong, stable, and balanced growth. This is, I think, a lesson that has been learned in much of the world through very painful experience of high inflation periods when central banks did not focus on inflation sufficiently as an objective. Starting about 25 years ago, though, people realized that if they focused on inflation, that as the primary objective of the central bank, that they could bring inflation down. And in much of the world, they've done that, so that in places where inflation was very high in the 1970s and 1980s, in much of the advanced world, in Europe, in the United States, for instance, they adopted inflation targeting or inflation targeting frameworks slowly, and those inflation targeting frameworks have brought inflation down to in the advanced world to numbers like 2 or 3%. Emerging market countries, I think, followed this example and have been very successful in bringing inflation down as well. As soon as you give up on inflation targeting, what happens is that you end up with very volatile inflation. Volatile inflation means that prices don't provide the signals to allocate resources in the economy, and as a consequence, you end up with actually lower growth. So I think it's very important that inflation and low, stable inflation remain the primary objective of central banks. And today, I would say that roughly 2/3 of global GDP is produced in jurisdictions that have something that looks like inflation targeting. People talk about the dual mandate of the Federal Reserve in the United States, but in fact, over the past decade, the Federal Reserve really adopted a framework where inflation is an objective for which they have an officially stated number. They say that they want 2% inflation. They have no stated objective for growth or for employment because it's impossible to know what those numbers would be. So again, they've adopted a framework where they may appear to have more than one objective, and they do care about growth, and every central bank should care about growth and employment, but the primary objective should remain inflation.
We are going through the disinflation stage right now. 2 years ago, we had inflation going up to 17%. Now it's almost down to our target. Our target is 4%, inflation is 4.4%. But we have still high interest rates. Our interest rates are 9%, and actually our inflation expectations, particularly of the public inflation expectations, which we measure with the survey, are more than 10%. But we are often criticized that we're too slow. We have to decrease rates faster because inflation is already low. So my question to you, whether high interest rates are justified in this inflation environment, and shall we react to inflation expectations of the public or not?
Well, I think it's again, the experience of other countries suggests that high interest rates are necessary to bring inflation down, and then you need a period when inflation is relatively stable, and you have to keep inflation stable to bring expectations down. Expectations come down slowly, but it's only after the expectations are anchored that you can, I think, safely bring your interest rates down to levels that would be associated with your long-run neutral or equilibrium rates. So in most of the world that has been successful in doing this, what you see is what you're describing here, which is that it takes a while for those expectations to fall. Inflation falls rapidly, but then people have to get used to this new low inflation regime and believe that the central bank will keep inflation low. And only then can you really go to your low interest rate level. The benefits of that, though, in the long run, I think, are really quite substantial. What we've seen again in the advanced world that's adopted this sort of framework is that then when inflation does start to move away from the target, expectations generally don't, because they're anchored at the target. And then that means that the central bank's job of bringing inflation back is much easier. So this is something that will pay a dividend, substantial dividend off in the future once your policy is viewed as being credible and the expectations have fallen.
One more issue. We switched to floating exchange rate regime 3 years ago, but exchange rate is still volatile. While Russia is a commodity-dependent economy, oil-dependent economy, oil price is volatile, so exchange rate is volatile, and then we also face some volatility of capital flows, which is sometimes also correlated with volatility of oil price. So also there is a discussion whether floating exchange rate is good for commodity producers like us, or we should go back to some much more managed regime than we have right now. So what does the international experience say on this?
Well, there I think I would point to, there are a number of countries that are equivalent in this sense. The one that I think is the best example to look at would be Mexico. Mexico, a number of years ago, was primarily an oil exporting country, a commodity producing country. And its exchange rate was originally managed, and it created crises inside of the country to have a managed exchange rate. And then they've allowed the exchange rate to float now for 20 years or more. And the volatility is something that the people inside of the country have learned how to manage. So they've developed financial markets so that they can hedge this exchange rate volatility. And the other thing that's happened is that in addition to the financial markets becoming deeper, is that the economy itself has diversified partially as a consequence of this. So my view of this is that your exchange rate is going to move. It can move either from day to day or week to week, as a floating rate does, or it can move suddenly and by large amounts on days when you don't know it's going to move. And the second one of those is very, very damaging normally, because people don't plan on it at all. But if you have exchange rates that are flexible, then these financial markets will naturally develop. People will be able to hedge. The risk will go to those people who are, or those institutions that are most able to bear it, and your economy, I think, will tend to thrive. The issue of commodities is an important one, and the solution to the challenges that are posed by having an economy that's based on the commodities is to encourage the economy to diversify. But this, it seems to me, is not something that the central bank has much to say about. This is something that has to do with other kinds of policies, more structural policies in your economy, where you have to try and encourage tradable sectors to develop, which has happened in other countries like Mexico that have been initially primarily commodity exporters. But again, this is not a job for the central bank. It's a job for the people and the policymakers who are involved in trade policy, involved in tax policy, involved in structural policies.
By the way, does monetary policy has to be in some way coordinated with fiscal, meaning do we need a fiscal framework for monetary policy to be successful?
Well, I think monetary policy, you can't leave monetary policy to do everything. So you need a fiscal framework that is working. There's a division of labor, I think, between a division of responsibility between the fiscal policy and the monetary policy. Fiscal policy's role is to ensure that you have built the right structural foundations for growth and that the government is doing in your country what it is that the people want. That's not what monetary policy does, but unless what monetary policy does is it tries to manage inflation and to a lesser extent, when it can, fluctuations in growth and employment at higher frequencies. But without a responsible fiscal authority, it would be very difficult for the monetary authority to do its job.
Okay, one last question. Let's take a broader view on the global economy. What do you think should be the major preoccupation for different central banks in the current global environment?
Oh, that's again, my view, I come back to inflation targeting. I think that inflation targeting has become a sort of coordination mechanism for the central banks and the monetary policy of the world. I think that today we are in a world where there seems to be this very large common component to inflation around the world that makes it as if the central banks are cooperating. This, I think, has been quite beneficial. It's much better. If I compare the inflation targeting period of the last 20 years or so with the fixed exchange rate period of the Bretton Woods era, I see much less volatility in the world today than I do if I look back in history. So that's my primary view. The second thing is that I think that central banks do need to build an equivalent framework for financial stability policy. This is very early days. We don't really know quite yet enough about how to do it, but the central bank has now, in most jurisdictions, been made responsible for financial stability. I used to say before the financial crisis that if you gave a central bank an inflation target, what you got was price stability. If you gave them a financial stability target, you got a financial stability report. And this report didn't give you financial stability in the end, but now we need to figure out what are the tools, what are the metrics that they should use for this.
Does this mean that regulations should be merged with the central banks back again in those countries where it's separated? My
view has been that you're better off if you merge supervision and into central banks. This is somewhat of a complicated issue, and it depends, I think, quite a lot on the way in which governance operates in your country. But the most critical thing is that there has to be very clear information flow at a very high frequency. So a lot of sharing of information all the time between the two. And the reason is that much of the economy-wide expertise lives inside of the central bank, while the supervisors tend to look at individual institutions. And the individual institution information is important for the macro, and so that information has to find its way to the people and with the right expertise. This is easier, in my view, organizationally, if everything's under the same roof. So I think there I would look to the Bank of England and their mechanism for sharing information, which is quite extensive, but they're, at least right now, they're quite unusual in the fact that everything seems to be in the same place. Even in those institutions where supervision is inside, it's still true that there are a lot of barriers to information sharing. So it's not so much whether it's in the same institution, but whether or not the information is very easy to share, so that you, as the macro people, can actually get the information about the banks.
Well, there's one thing which you mentioned is very interesting, that central banks have expertise on macro issues. What is the role for research and analytics in the central banks?
Oh, that's a great question, and one that I've worked on for many years. I think that research is extremely important inside of central banks for a number of reasons. The first reason, I think, is that it makes the policies better. In order to ensure that the policy advice that is coming from the staff of the central bank to the decision makers, to the governor, to the deputy governors, to the monetary policy committee, is as high quality as possible, you want to make sure that the people who are generating the analysis know what's at the frontier. This is easiest if they're also trying to push the frontier forward, then they have an incentive to know. So you get high quality people with the skills that you need. It's of course also, I think, very important to have research inside of a central bank, because the central bank is a public institution, and research is and knowledge about your economy is something that's useful for everyone. So this means that the research in the central bank serves the general government and business community as well. It helps with your interactions with everyone else. And finally, I think that if the central bank has high quality research, then the public statements of the governor and the deputy governors, the decision makers, when they give speeches and interviews and comments, everyone knows that they actually have behind what they're saying high quality analytical work. And all three of these things then, I think, are very important for supporting the fact that you need high quality research in your central bank.
I see. My last question is about communication policy. Remember, Greenspan used to say that if you understand what I'm saying, you misunderstood me, something like this. Now central banks communicate a lot, and we even have forward guidance and commitments on behalf of the central banks to some future policies. So is it a temporary phenomenon because of the zero low bound, or central banks, even in the normal times, should continue communications and communications about their forward-looking policy aspects as well?
So I think that the current communication policy of central banks is an outgrowth of the inflation targeting frameworks that were put in place 25 years ago. So it's not a phenomena of the crisis or zero interest rates or unconventional policy or anything like that. The reason for clear communication is, I think, twofold. One of them has to do with more sort of politics and the way that we organize our society, and the other one with actual the effectiveness of the policy. So on the first, I think that central banks are given a lot of power and a lot of discretion. They're independent from their political systems in jurisdictions where they work the best. And that independence and power comes with responsibility and accountability. And the best way to hold people accountable is to force them to explain what they're doing. And that's how central banks are organized, is you give them power, you give them independence, and you ask them in return to explain. The second one is that with effectiveness, there I believe very strongly that markets and the economy, the decision makers in the economy and in the financial markets should react to the data, to developments in the economy, not to the central bankers. So the announcement of the central bank of a policy, either maintaining interest rates or changing interest rates or changing the balance sheet or something like that, those things should not themselves be surprises. So they should not be shocks. They might provide a little bit of information about the decision makers, the monetary policy committee, or the governor's thinking, but by and large it's about interpretation, it's not about the data. So the way in which the central bank is going to react when data comes out is something that should basically be known. And that actually reduces volatility in the economy and makes the central bank's policy much more effective, because when the data comes, everybody knows how you will react.
I see. So basically the central bank should not communicate the policy itself, but rather how it will react to the
react.
data.
Right.
And you work with the analysts to analyze the data
Yes.
and to forecast how the central bank
Yes.
will behave based on that.
Right, right.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been my pleasure to come back to St. Petersburg and to participate in your summer school and in your Congress.